Okay, the second installment, second variation of changes we can believe in, is going to use borrowed chords and secondary dominant chords. And you have a list here on this page talking about how borrowed chords are maybe the most common way that pop composers use chords outside of the key. Most pop music is strictly diatonic and bases its interest on lyrics and rhythm, but you get some clever composers that use borrowed chords like the Beatles and Elton John, Billy Joel, and Stevie Wonder. Those same people use secondary dominant chords, Paul Simon, Sting, Carole King, of course. Classical-based harmony ideas, not as deep as Bach, going through many keys, but because trying to keep the music accessible. You can see where borrowed chords come from. They come from parallel keys. They can come from parallel modes. That's modal interchange. We could talk about the parallel Dorian, the parallel Lydian, the parallel Phrygian if you want later on in the course. But traditionally, borrowed chords come from the parallel natural minor, parallel harmonic minor, or parallel melodic minor. And you can see the variety that can be presented. You get two different types of one chord, major or minor, two different types of two chord, minor or diminished, two different roots for the three chord, right, E minor or E flat, the flat 3 chord, or the flat 3 augmented, because you can use different types of minor scales to derive your chords, and if you use the notes from harmonic or melodic minor, you get augmented. The 4 chord can be major or minor. The 5 chord can be major or minor if you're using natural minor. And the 6 chord can be A minor, but it can also be from A flat, the flat 7 chord. And if you're using melodic minor, it becomes a diminished chord. And the 7 chord can be a flat 7 chord or a 7 chord diminished. So you get all this variety, and this is not even talking about what happens when you add sevenths to these chords, which makes it even more variety. Most pop music follows the rules of early classical music, Baroque music, where seventh chords were only built on the 5th degree. That's why it's called the dominant 7th chord. Other scale degrees were usually just triads and didn't add the 7th. That's why the 5 chord doesn't say it's the 5 dominant 7th chord. It just says 5-7, because we weren't adding sevenths to other chords. And then people like Bach and Handel would make the music a little more complicated. Some people thought too complicated, so classical music simplified things a little bit harmonically, but eventually the Romantic era and the Impressionists and the avant-garde took over, and anything goes at this point. There are the traditional secondary dominant chords. You can build a dominant chord on any degree, but you have to put at least one note from outside the key to create that. But what it does is it creates this dominant to tonic tension and release, because you're changing that. The dominant chord has a tritone in the middle of it that wants to resolve. And if I put that on any scale degree in the key of C, for instance on D, which is normally minor, if I make it D7, it wants to go to G. And that's why it's called a 5 of 5. If I put it on E flat, that's a borrowed chord, and I put a 7th on it, it wants to go to A flat, which is a flat 6 chord in the key of C minor, which can be used as a borrowed chord in the key of C major. If I put a dominant chord on 3, E minor, make it dominant, it wants to go to A, which could be A minor. If it's diatonic, but I can make the A dominant, and then it wants to go to D minor or to D7, and then to G7, and then you're back to C. And a lot of tunes just go around the circle of fifths like that. E7 to A7 to D7 to G7, back to C. For instance, the bridge of I Got Rhythm, Sweet Georgia Brown, lots of sections of jazz tunes cycle their way counterclockwise around the circle of fifths. Call it the cycle of fourths if you want. The flat 7 chord in the key of C, B flat, could just be a borrowed chord. If I make it a dominant chord, it becomes a secondary dominant chord, a 5-7 of flat 3. And those chords don't necessarily sound like they're in the key of C, but they are just one simple rule away, and so they're perfectly legitimate to use and easy to analyze in the key of C without making any chords fancier than a seventh chord. Everything's either a triad or a dominant seventh. We'll talk about sus chords and add nines and different qualities, and of course seventh chords with extensions and sharp nines and all that to make things even more interesting to the ear. Let's look at the composition variation, and you see that I've simply gone with a 1 chord and then the borrowed flat 7 and then the 4. Now that was a progression that was in the original composition at the end, 1, flat 7, and 4. Then I go to a secondary dominant, 5 of 6, and then a 6 chord, and then a secondary dominant 5 of 3. And here it wants to go to the 3 chord. And then instead of going to F major, I go to F minor, a borrowed chord. So I hear 2 minor chords right next to each other. And that's kind of a dirge-like sound to it. If you actually play that sustained melody, then suddenly this fairly simple substitution becomes a little more complicated harmonically. This E in the melody is the 3rd of the 1st chord, which is not fancy, but it is the sharp 11 of the B flat chord. So it has a very Lydian sound, and then it is the major 7 of F major. That sounds kind of nice if you leave that pedal on there. And then the root of E7, the 5th of A minor, and then this, it's the 11th, a half step above the 3rd of the B7 chord, which is traditionally considered a no-no to put a 4 against a 3 because they clash, but these days we don't mind clash. I like that sound. And then you improvise over this. If you sustain the E through the F minor, it becomes a major 7 over a minor, so a minor major 7 chord. Next part of the tune starts with a secondary dominant. Instead of going 2, 5, 1 like the original composition, we go 5 of 2, then the 2 chord, and then the flat 3 chord. Right now the flat 3 chord, it doesn't have a 7th on it, but it kind of functions as a 5 of flat 6 and goes to the flat 6 major, A flat major 7. And then B minor 7 flat 5 is just the 7 chord. It's the 7 chord in C major. It's also the 7 chord in C melodic minor. And then A minor 7, that's just the 6 chord in melodic minor. So I'm borrowing the 7th chord from melodic minor. And then the D minor 7 flat 5 is the 2 chord in C natural minor or harmonic minor. And then the 5 chord with the root in the melody. Not that exciting. But it resolves. So that is variation number 2. You try to come up with tunes that have borrowed chords or secondary dominants that you know, and write your own variation of a tune you wrote, or someone else's tune if you want, and try to substitute some borrowed chords or secondary dominant chords. Next time we're going to talk about inversions. Thanks.